and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab and Co-Creation Studio Talks. I am Sarah Walzen, the director of the lab. I'm a white woman. I use she, her pronouns. I have white hair, glasses, and I'm wearing a black and white sweater. I'm thrilled to introduce Verity McIntosh and Catherine Allen, who are here today to talk to us about safety, policy, and human rights in virtual environments. A little bit about them. Verity is director and principal investigator of Immersive Arts, a $7.5 million program that she founded of research, training, funding, and events designed to support over 200 artists in the UK to engage with immersive technologies. She is Associate Professor of Virtual and Extended Realities at the University of the West of England, where she founded one of Europe's first dedicated master's programs championing XR as a creative medium. Her research includes inclusive and accessible experience design, XR ethics, and the application of human rights in social and virtual environments. She has written and spoken about the creative industries and immersive tech sector around the world, and her work has been discussed by the UK House of Commons and the House of Lords, the EU Parliament, the Council of Europe, and in many print and media publications. Catherine Allen is the CEO and lead consultant of Limina Immersive, which she also founded. She is most well known as a UK leading expert in immersive technology, expanding the audience and creative base of the medium while advising on responsible use of XR. Her work has played a significant role in informing policy, with a current focus on helping shape VR and AR inclusion in the UK's online safety bill. The work has been recognized through an honorary doctorate from the University of Warwick. Before she's founded Limina Immersive, she was a creator of two of BBC's first virtual reality experiences in 2015 and 16. And she found it an incredible medium, but she was frustrated by the narrow audience. And so that's when she founded Limina Immersive in 2016. It's a VR events and research company dedicated to bringing immersive tech to broader audiences. She has continuously shared findings about audience needs back to universities and the sector in the form of reports of consulting, seminars, and workshops. She's authored several seminal public reports that have influenced policy. Her public engagement work includes expert op-eds, comment and analysis on immersive tech to outlets, including Radio 4's Today, program, the Sunday Times, Bloomberg, British Vogue, Wired, and The Guardian. So it is my great pleasure to have you both here today, and I look forward to your talk, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's really brilliant to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, so give me 1 second. Hopefully you can see this okay. So yeah, today we are talking about, Verity and I are talking about, we've had quite a few years now where we've been working on, I guess it's a sort of strand of work together and a mission really, where we want to share with you, what we've done and what this mission is, around safety, policy, and the translation of human rights into immersive environments. It's something we've kind of, Verity and I have come to from different angles. So I'm not in academia, Verity is. We bring lots of different things to it, and I guess as a team, it's great actually to both be here and to be sharing with you what we've done, because we were just saying earlier, it's rare that we actually get to present both of us. So usually it's just one in our sort of separate worlds. So yeah, we'll be running through our work, which includes today why we aim for safety and human rights in immersive environments, an overview of what the harms are, how we've worked with policymakers around the world to do something about this, and a look at some possible futures as well. And of course, we want to have a conversation with you. We would love to get your thoughts as well and your views. We're really, really interested in your responses. So yeah, to start with, when we're talking about safety, what we really mean by that is mitigating the risk of harm. So I often think of a doctor's oath, do no harm. I just think it's really, really helpful. If you're making emerging technology or any form of technology, really, you should aim to do no harm. So I think this should apply here too. And the work that Verity and I do together is usually centered around reducing the risk of things going wrong with immersive tech. So through research and then publishing that research and then policy work, we look at what the risks are, and then we come up with recommendations for companies, for policymakers, and sometimes law enforcement as well. So today we'll talk quite a bit about the risks from immersive media. But of course, there are lots of exciting positives as well, and we never want to play that down. There's so much, I mean, that's why we're both in this, and anyone else in the immersive field, I think, would say similarly here, right? That the magic of immersive technology is really quite alluring to be in as a career. So it's almost like sometimes we take that for granted, but we love it. But it's, I think, driven by that love and that passion that also we want to talk about the risks. And we'll talk today about the broad risks, so societal risks and risks to users, rather than looking at risks to, say, individual employees or business performance, although this could be indirect, of course. But before we dive right in, Verity and I will each give you a bit of an introduction to each of us. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, my sort of first forays into the world of virtual reality were producing two of the BBC's first public-facing VR experiences. So one of them, Easter Rising, Voice of a Rebel, this came out, or I started working on it a decade ago now, I can say, 2015. It came out in 2016 to mark the centenary of the Easter Rising in Ireland, in Dublin. And it was the BBC's, I guess, a way of exploring virtual reality documentary in a way that is very, I guess, is quite grounded, and to an audience that could be, quite sort of quite broad, in theory. So I produced this work and then went on to exec produce another VR experience there as well. Absolutely loved the production process and putting blood, sweat, and tears into creating this quite complicated something that's quite tricky in terms of subject matter, editorial policy, but came out absolutely beautifully. But there was a frustration on the audience that it did reach, because, and I guess this is no surprise now to anyone here, of course the end audience was quite narrow, because it had to be people who had the VR headsets already. And people, cast your mind back to 2016, who had the VR headsets already, they tended to be people who bought the headsets for gaming or like super early adopters. So it tended to be mainly men who are quite well off as well. And people who've got the leisure time as well to try out new things. So that really did limit it. And I wanted to, I guess, address this. So after finishing up my contracts at BBC, I founded Limina initially as a VR theatre. So we created a sort of format for audiences to experience VR, like artistic and cultural content, live and in person, in arts and sort of cultural centres. So for instance, like in a local cinema or mixed art multimedia arts centre, we had a sort of a set that we would tour. Then we even had an ongoing 6-month pop-up in Bristol, where we're based, and we really sort of iterated to establish a way that felt like just normal for people who really like broad sort of demographics, really people who just represented as much as possible more the general population, to just come and experience creative virtual reality. And yeah, I think I'd sort of felt very proud when we got some audience feedback that we had gone so far on the duty of care that we were a bit like a cross between a cinema and a spa. So yeah, we got to over 15,000 audience members, and we learned a lot about what audiences want and what they don't want from this new medium, and what they're scared about, like real, valid anxieties as well. But then COVID happened. So we had all this knowledge, we'd really got going. We started touring internationally with some really big big shows, like we had a Cirque du Soleil VR experience and a David Attenborough experience we were touring. But yeah, COVID happened, and so we had to stop all that, and we pivoted to being a consultancy and research organisation, which at the time was really scary and difficult. But actually, it's worked out well. It's certainly different, and we've translated a lot of that learning into what I hope is, positive impact on society, and sort of influencing things like UK legislation, for instance, around immersive. And so Verity now, this is where we've done a lot to sort of team up together. And yeah, here just some of the papers. There's just a few of the papers that we've authored together. As well as this, we've worked. So I'll go through them very briefly. The Institute of Engineering Technology initially commissioned us to write a quick overview. It was quite a short paper, but quite impactful paper on the harms and what can be done about them in the metaverse, as we were calling it back then, 2021, 2022. Then the NSPCC commissioned us to really in depth explore risks and existing harms to children due to immersive technologies. Then the Council of Europe commissioned us to also look at the positives as well as share the potential and existing threats. And then more recently, we've submitted a paper to Frontiers journal, which Verity I know is going to tell you more about. So we've very happy to share some links and share references. But what we talk about today is drawn from this sort of body of work that we've worked on together. Over to you, Verity.
Thank you. Yeah, really great to be here. I'm just going to pop in briefly here to let you know who you're in the room with, and then I'll come back a little later to describe some of the work. So my name is Verity McIntosh. As Sarah kindly introduced, I work in a number of different contexts, but just to give you a quick route into the sector, I know everyone in this room will have had a different route into the immersive sector, and it's always nice to understand where we're coming from. So I wasn't always in academia. I spent the best part of a decade as a managing producer, running a space called the Pervasive Media Studio, which is part of the Watershed Cultural Centre in Bristol. The Pervasive Media Studio, if you ever get the chance to go do, it's a sort of an extraordinary place for artists, technologists and researchers to spend time with each other, to explore ideas, to take risks and to learn together. And it's a space that really kind of champions that confluence of art, technology and culture. And so I worked basically with several hundred artists and technologists and researchers over the years to help them to kind of develop and realise their ideas. I then was one of the co-founders of a space called Bristol VR Lab, which was a space that was sort of set up to try and create a similar kind of hub space for people who are particularly interested in immersive technologies from a number of different sectors. And around the same kind of time, I moved to the University of the West of England and helped them to set up and then run a master's programme called the Masters of Virtual and Extended Realities, which was one of the first, possibly the second in Europe, depending on how we feel about who won that competition, but certainly one of the first in Europe to be specifically offering a master's programme in this space, and certainly one of the first to champion immersive media as its own kind of artistic discipline. So yeah, we've worked with some really incredible people. I think some of you are in the room today, so congratulations and we love you. More recently, I have been moving into the research space. So I've worked over the last few years with a number of extraordinary creative pioneers in the immersive sector. Most recently, sort of Marshmallow Laser Feast, All Seeing Eye, Awari, Headset. I tend to work in partnership between academia and industry because I feel like that's where the real knowledge can be unlocked, and we can learn together and in lockstep with one another. And as part of that, I've been recently running something called the Immersive Arts Programme, which is less relevant to our conversation today, but really happy to pick up conversations later on if anyone wants to explore it further. It's basically a nationwide UK-based development scheme to support artists to develop work using immersive technologies. We are a national funding scheme. We have the equivalent of about sort of $5 million to go directly to artists, and we run a scheme that also provides mentoring and training and events. So that's a quick intro to me. I'm going to hand you back to Catherine to set the scene for today's conversation.
So yeah, when we talk about safety and policy and immersive experiences, I think it's good to start off with looking at what makes immersive different. And I think intuitively we all know the answer here, but it's good to really set it out, because when speaking externally to policymakers who maybe have very little, if any, experience, say, putting on a virtual reality headset, it really helps to be able to articulate it. So this is where we start. And really, I would say that immersive media is what's human imagination. It's sort of been bottled, and then it's been scaled. It's much more doing rather than viewing. It's experiential, so it goes beyond symbolic representations that tend to happen in glowing rectangles. So most of the media we consume, probably right now for all of us, it happens in glowing rectangles. And what's really, really different about immersive is, of course, it surrounds you, but it's actually that it's that sense of presence. It's the fact that you're doing. It's the fact that you're complicit in the things that you do. So yeah, I think the crucial difference between VR and most other screen mediums, it is that presence, and it's the fact that it's immediate. It's simulation rather than representation. It tricks you into thinking this is an immediate experience. And because of that, the critical distance is much less. Also, there's a lot more ethical implications that come with doing rather than viewing. So when you're doing something, you're often, as I mentioned earlier, there's that complicity. You're often complicit in that activity, in that action. So that can really impact then how that feels for other people when you're maybe talking about it afterwards, how it feels for your own sort of autobiographical memory. So I think that's what I often come back to when talking to, especially when talking to policymakers who have maybe never tried virtual reality, say, before. And then thinking about why is it even necessary to be thinking about these themes around safety and policy? Why for responsible innovation in the immersive space? And I think this quote from Arthur C. Clarke really, really helps, which is that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And immersive tech really does feel like magic, right? Like we strap a screen on your face and there's that wow moment. It feels, and it's a magic trick, which tricks your body and your brain pretty much into feeling that you're in a different place or a different time. Like it tells you to suspend your disbelief. And because it's sort of beyond the possible, it's got that magic trick element to it. Guess that power should be used, really, it should be used responsibly. So yeah, I guess it's a cliche, but with power comes responsibility, because magic is like super powerful and we need to learn how to use this new magic as a society. Yeah, with that responsibility. And of course, innovation is laden with risk, and any newness brings with it uncertainty. And with uncertainty comes risk. So as a society, of course, we have to use power to innovate responsibly. And there is that moral argument that why we should do it. But there is also, of course, a commercial argument, which is that if we don't mitigate these risks, we won't be able to seize opportunities. If there are risks that come with anything new, as I said, but if they're not mitigated, then it will be impossible, likely to move forward into anything that looks like mainstream adoption. So actually, good safety measures and even good regulation can make it possible for innovations to reach the masses and to become a part of everyday life. So this is why I come back to this mantra, which is on the slide over and over, which is mitigating risks will allow us to seize opportunities. And there are so many examples of innovations that couldn't cross this chasm between early adopters and the early majority on the technology adoption life cycle, because the risks weren't mitigated and they couldn't find a way to mitigate them, or maybe they didn't care. And therefore it never took off. So yeah, I could talk about lots and lots of examples. Later on, I'll talk more about immersive. But just to sort of look more positively, there are examples of innovations that took off because the risks were mitigated. So seatbelts in cars are like a really obvious example. There was only so far that cars could become mainstream before seatbelts existed, when they were quite dangerous. We've also got, for instance, lawnmowers and what's called the dead man switch, where you have to hold on a lawnmower, hold the switch down in order to use it. I think that's regulation in the UK. Lawnmowers didn't take off until that existed. We've also got even online shopping that didn't really take off until consumers had trust in it, and there was SSL encryption. So yeah, rather than mitigating harm, rather than stifling innovation, even regulation can actually support regulation. There is that argument. And here's just one story of something safety related that has really helped innovation, and therefore like changed our whole the whole way that cities work for us and populations are spread out, is the safety brake on elevators, or lifts as we say in the UK. So here's a cityscape that us Brits are pretty familiar with, and you probably will be too, the London high rises, the London cityscape. And it's typical of any global city to see this many high-rise buildings, but this norm wasn't possible until safety brakes in lifts were invented in the 1850s. So lift technology had actually existed for centuries before a safety brake was invented in the 1850s. But because it was so dangerous, you had to have really specialist training, and people did die because of elevators, and often used in things like mining shafts. But when an inventor called Elisha Otis presented his safety brake at for elevators at the New York Crystal Palace exhibit, it was seen at the time, and really look back, and it really was a momentous moment, because it meant that elevators became safe, and that meant that buildings that the public went into, not specialists, could be really high, and then you could have much more city density than there was at the time. So it totally changed the way that our cities and populations are spread out. So now moving back into the world of XR, I'll give you an example of something pretty major that actually did hold back the growth of XR, I think, initially, and especially the growth of in-location immersive, and that is the cleanliness of the headsets. So these, you might remember in Best Buy demos, were across Best Buys across the US, and they were rolled out, and quite a lot of press around it too, but then quite quickly withdrawn. And this is rumor rather than any like facts that I have, but rumor in the industry at the time was because of pink eye outbreak or conjunctivitis. And there were also cases at tech conferences as well of conjunctivitis outbreaks around VR headset demos. There'd been studies since that showed that yes, VR headsets really do harbour germs very well. The sponging, especially, the moist environment, the dark environment, is perfect breeding ground for bacteria. So yeah, there was a study that University of Mississippi did, looking at headsets in the University of Mississippi Computer Lab over a period of time. And the researcher, Dr. Benjamin Creel, found that there was a staph bacteria, which you may know it causes like skin infections, MRSA, food poisoning. There was also a type of bacteria that causes that smell in laundry when it's not dried properly, that very particular weird sweet smell. He found that, and that really resonates with me because I have smelt that on VR headsets at tech conferences. So it's kind of funny, but also I think it really, research I've done since talking to people about why they didn't want to try VR is because often there was the opportunity in public, but they didn't know the headset had been cleaned, or maybe it really hadn't been cleaned, and the public didn't want to take that risk. So we know that it can hold things back when you've got risks that aren't mitigated. So now let's move to look at the harms that Verity and I have identified in our work, our policy work, and what we've spent quite a bit of time talking to policymakers and law enforcement and other stakeholders about. Before I dive in, I want to note that I will be, for the next sort of 5 minutes or so, I will occasionally be touching on themes that might be challenging around CSA, child sexual abuse. So feel free to sort of turn the sound off for that time if you like. So yeah, now looking at immediate harms, these are harms that are actually happening in the world of immersive already, and there's evidence for this. So firstly, children spending unsupervised time in open social VR spaces, which on its own isn't necessarily an issue, but then that means that grooming has happened. There's many instances, real prevalence of grooming, attempted and unfortunately successful instances of children being groomed in this space. And sometimes it forms part of organised gangs of offenders who would scout victims and then convince them to come back to a private space. So say that might be on the platform VR chat in a public lobby, public space, and then they would be, as part of the grooming, the victims would be invited into a private space in VR chat. That's just an example. Sometimes it would be more one-on-one, however, over the course of months or even years, one child being targeted, for instance, by one offender. There was a case in Florida over lockdowns and 2020, 2021 time of an offender who actually, after having groomed the child for quite a long time on VR chat, travelled across state to live in her walk-in wardrobe in her bedroom without the parents knowing. And I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks that he managed it before he was found out. But this grooming can lead to real-life contact offending. Then there's also harassment, abuse and bullying in open social VR spaces is another key harm. It's very apparent, you know, if you just drop in randomly on an immersive social VR space, it's hard like not to witness this sometimes. And there was a sort of, I guess you could say, a media trend for journalists to say, all right, I'm going into the metaverse for a day in around sort of 2022 kind of time, and would discover quite quickly that just the level of abuse and bullying and harassment that's happening in these spaces. So that has been quite prevalent, and there are safety features now to address that. Maybe things have improved a bit, but the safety features tend to be very victim driven. So it's up to you to block, it's up to you to report. And sometimes that means that the language around it can also sound quite victim blamey. So yeah, moving on, other harms. So sexual assault and harassment in VR spaces. So that's specifically when we're talking about general harassment, general bullying. This one, when it's of a sexual nature. Again, it's appeared to be pretty prevalent. We don't have quantitative data, but qualitative data says it's not rare. And victims or survivors, they often recall the way, even though it's virtual, they still feel violated on like a bodily level. And it could well be due to that phenomena of avatar transference, where you feel so connected to your avatar that you identify with it to a level where when your avatar is violated, that is you. And also there's the phenomena. This is more something that users have given a name to rather than from an academic perspective, but the phenomenon of phantom touch, where when somebody touches you in VR, you actually get this feelings as if on your body, as if they have touched you in real life. And it's often tested in VR spaces using the head pat. That's sort of a first step to develop phantom touch. There's also psychologically blurred lines between reality and virtual reality that have been reported in many users. I think this comes back to that when you're doing, you're not just viewing. And so therefore, our memories of those experiences, they form part of our sort of autobiographical memory, part of our sense of self, and they can really have an impact on us to the same degree even that a real life experience might. So there's anecdotes from users about VR experiences that form them part of their dreams. I know I got that quite a lot during lockdown. The amount of time I spent in VR, I was having dreams happening in the VR spaces that me and Verity were hanging out in together. But it can actually be a harm, and it can be serious. For example, in children, there was you may well be aware of this study from Stanford, where they gave children the opportunity of swimming with orcas in virtual reality, and found immediately most of the children, they were preschoolers, most of them, when they asked about it, said no, it wasn't real. But over time, as in longitudinally, children began to recall, where it was about 50% children then began to recall it as something that had actually happened, that they had indeed swam with orcas. So a sense of blurriness around what is real and what isn't, what are real memories and not, that could be a harm. Seems could well lead to other harms as well. And then there's physical injuries and property damage. Now, it may seem kind of funny, the idea that, you might be flailing your arms around and then hurt yourself or smash your TV or something when you're in VR. But it can lead to something, really serious, and it's growing. So there was a study from the Dignity Health Group, which I think lays it out quite well, that whilst in 2017, the data he found that injuries from VR-related injuries in the emergency room in the US were only 125 in that year. By 2021, it had gone up 352% to 1,336 emergency room visits due to virtual reality-related injuries. And the most common injury was a fracture, followed by laceration. This part makes me quite sad, which was patients, this is a quote from the study, patients aged 0 to 5 most commonly experience injuries to the face. So that's very young children being put in VR who are getting, hurt enough that they're being sent into the emergency room. Yeah, it is 62% of injuries that children that young experience are to their face. Then moving to more harms. Sorry, this is the really tricky and difficult slide. Disassociation and derealization. So about having a lack of your own body, especially coming out of virtual space. The investigative police team that we worked with for the NSPCC research, in interviews with offenders, they found this was a theme that would increase the distancing that offenders then had from the real world, and that sort of alienation from the real world, was this feeling of you come out of VR and feeling like the real world is like a dream. And then finally, this is one that I actually moved from future harms, which was what my slide from when I presented it last was, into immediate harms, because it's happening now to the extent where it's very prevalent, which we know from working with this investigative police team, is what the term I would use. There's no perfect term for this, but I think maybe sex simulators. Sex maybe isn't the right term though, because so often it's replicating a real person and it's non-consensual. So creating a VR simulation of a sex act or several sex acts with an individual, and that tends to be people who exist in real life. So often, most commonly, it's celebrities, but also there is a sort of a group, you could say a community of people who commission real people that they know to be part of these sex act simulations, as in commission 3D models of real people that they know. So non-consensually, that person has no knowledge, and it tends to be women and children who are who the simulations are of. So that's maybe one of the most difficult slides, most challenging. So yeah, come back to that now. Now, this is looking at widespread future harms, but quite likely. So being a sort of mass desensitization to shocking or violent stimuli. We know that it's used already in training for firefighters, for instance. VR is used to help you feel less scared when you go into a burning building. So, the theory is that if you go into in virtual reality into a certain space or go through a certain experience over and over again, which otherwise would be shocking, you can desensitize yourself to it. I think more research should be done into this field though. But okay, moving on. The very, very big data. First I said big data in this slide, and I thought, no, this is extremely big data, because the data that is taken on, for instance, biometric tracking of, say, pupil size, where you're looking, eyeball tracking, could also be other elements as well if you have further sort of peripherals, so for instance, heart rate, blood pressure even. Those extra data points could lead to a real lack of mental privacy, which is a harm in and of itself, and also could lead to other future harms. There's the capability of persuasion and radicalization. So we've seen VR be used for good, for say, you may have heard the term the empathy machine, to encourage people, say, to do good things like give to charity, have more empathy for people who are not like yourself, for instance, and which is generally a really good thing. But those same techniques and tools could be used for radicalization, say, persuasion of maybe extremist groups, for instance. And then finally, an increased digital divide in general, where you have the sort of haves and have-nots, the people who are in immersive and the people who are not in this immersive. So people having this, I think very much for AR, this can apply as well, where you've got people living in different realities, not much sense of sort of shared experiences across society, which could lead to a sort of more granular society and also have an impact on democracy and how democracy works. So now I'll hand over to Verity, who's going to talk about all this research that we've done and worked together. Then where has that gone out in the world?
Thank you. Okay. Just to check, are we seeing a big old picture of some sort of British-looking politicians?
Yes.
Fabulous. There we go. Thank you. So yeah, it's great to pick up the thread. I think one of the things that we found when we started doing that research is that possibly the timing was good, or possibly it was motivating conversations in some different kind of corridors of power than had been discussed before. And Catherine and I found ourselves being invited in lots of different contexts to speak with policymakers who were starting to take an interest in this space, had perhaps seen some of the media reports, some of the articles and concerns, and being aware that perhaps they had a role to play in working out what their role was in terms of governance, in terms of regulation, in terms of the legal system, and wanted to start sort of figuring that out with us. So in the UK, for example, as Sarah mentioned, our work's been discussed in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which is the sort of two spaces of government. We've been working with all-party parliamentary groups and giving various kind of evidence and advice to different governing bodies and advocacy groups. We've worked quite a lot in recent times with our European friends, particularly the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, to help them and their sort of 46 member states to try and understand the opportunities and challenges that are available to European citizens within this sector, and to try and make some specific policy recommendations that would help them to enact their own mission, which is to advocate for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, often over kind of corporate and commercial interests. So we've worked with them, with people around the world, and I think it's helpful that we can sort of reflect something of the different attitudes and the different ways that those policy decisions are sort of now turning up and not turning up in different ways in different parts of the world. Obviously, some of these sort of narratives around these virtual environments is that they're sort of apolitical, or they're kind of aterritorial, and that they apply somehow kind of outside of different sort of centralized systems. But in fact, those government entities who are responsible for the citizens that they represent are taking an interest in different ways. So some fun pictures of papers. If you wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive, some of the more kind of policy facing work that we've been doing in this space, there is an expert report specifically published by the Council of Europe, which goes into some of the kind of the detailed areas about areas of opportunity and risk. And there's a slightly easier read Frontiers paper that came out quite recently, which is specifically focused on what policymakers need to know about harassment in these. The metaverse word continues. I suspect in this room we could all raise an eyebrow about whether the word metaverse is still the right word, but if we allow it to be synonymous with effectively multi-person spatial computing environments, for the sake of this conversation, policymakers love the word metaverse, so it's still here for now. Some of the areas that we've been particularly asked to zoom in on and have been trying to kind of help policymakers understand better are just on the screen now. We won't kind of dive into all of those, don't worry. I appreciate many of you are eating sandwiches and have a limited time window today. But just to kind of zoom in on a few of those to start perhaps some conversation starters for our Q&A, I'm going to take us through a few of the areas that we've been really diving into with some of this research. So as a starting point, health and well-being is a really interesting area in this immersive media space, because obviously, as many of you will be aware, these sort of XR experiences have been shown to play a really positive role in things like pain management, exposure therapies. There have been some really good outcomes in clinical settings around stronger adherence to recovery programs, physiotherapy, a lot more kind of patient adherence to programs in home that can limit the amount of times they have to come into clinical settings. There's higher likelihood of sticking to weight management programs, for example. So we're seeing a lot of kind of clinical contexts, therapeutic environments. The question around sort of using these sorts of tools and technologies to enhance or to help to alter or shift mood, to manage anxiety, offering forms of social connection where you can use some of these tools to connect to people remote from you if you don't have access to good social contact due to kind of extended hospitalization, for example. These are all ways that we're starting to see these tools be used in really kind of positive, what we might call sort of social prescribing ways to support health and well-being. We also sort of working with governments to understand what it means for a commercial setting. So obviously there's all sorts of new marketplaces that potentially open up when we start to think about being able to do business and to work in this new kind of virtual spatial environment. We've got very used to, in a kind of a post or kind of continuing COVID environment, to working as we are now, to be kind of present with one another through Zoom calls and through different kind of video conferencing systems. But we also, I think, are all very aware of the limitations of doing that in such a sort of a flat screen way. There's quite a lot of fatigue that comes with working over time in these remote sort of flat settings. And there's been lots of suggestion that being able to work with these more spatial paradigms is much closer to being in person with someone. It's not the same, but it opens up different things around body language and eye contact and relational experiences and collaboration and cooperation that can be quite different to the sort of remote working paradigm that we've got used to. So potentially it can open up new ways of working. It can invite new people into the workforce. So it becomes much more about, do you have access to these tools rather than what postcode or zip code are you in? In theory, you can work according to kind of people who are in the same time zone as you, but not necessarily in the same city as you. So there's different ways that the kind of working cultures can evolve around these spaces. There's all kinds of commercial challenges for governments as well about what monopoly looks like with these kinds of spatial computing platforms. And there are some significant concerns to be raised already about the fact that quite a narrow number of companies are leading the investment and the proliferation of every aspect of the ecosystem, from the hardware to the software to the publishing platforms to the moderation to the decision about who gets to participate and who doesn't. So there's challenges to the commercial sector in terms of corporate monopoly that has yet to be really kind of addressed at a policy level. But it certainly has the potential to kind of transform the way we think about being together, and that includes how we work together. In terms of creativity, again, I suspect in this room, this is a really obvious point, but it's really important. So I think just to reiterate that obviously immersive media has really kind of unlocked a whole new tool set for artists and the culture sector to be able to express in different ways, a range of different creative approaches. Again, that business of being able to bring audiences together to participate in the work and to be in the center of the work is a really radical shift, and potentially offers a really kind of open forum for participation for those who are not able to kind of go to those big sort of bastions of cultural space around galleries and museums. So it can create a more kind of egalitarian democratic space for creative participation. The big project that I'm working on at the moment is this project called Immersive Arts, and we're really excited to be on the cusp now of supporting our first round of artists. We'll be announcing the first round of successful applicants at the end of this week, and we'll be starting to see a new generation of creative practitioners who are really kind of pushing what's possible with these new tools and technologies, and bringing some of those problems to the creative space, as well as some of those celebratory things. We've spoken a bit about harassment and abuse, so I don't think I'm going to spend too much time here, but just to kind of reinforce, I guess, that at that sort of user interactions level, where human beings are going into virtual spaces and interacting with each other, we are seeing huge proliferation of abusive behaviours that outside of these virtual environments would not be considered kind of socially acceptable, would be subject to punitive measures from legal and law enforcement, but for some reason is effectively becoming almost like a kind of a common form of experience within these virtual spaces. Catherine touched on this as well. So I think just to give a little bit of background, I guess, to the data and privacy question, when we are on our laptops or our phones, as perhaps we are now, there's a certain amount of information that could be gleaned about how long we stay in one place, where we are, whether we tap, whether we click, whether we scroll, whether we dwell for a period of time. That, as we know, is the sort of the economics of social media. It's the economics of a lot of the way the internet works. And with this sort of unflattening of the internet that immersive technology gives us, the granularity of the data that is then available for data capitalists is spectacular. It's not an accident that the same companies that run social media companies and search engines have moved into the immersive space. The majority of the sort of business models that are proposed around these social interactive spaces is that behavioural data, where you look, how long you look for, whether your pupils dilate when you look at something, is such invaluable data, because it speaks to your preferences, it speaks to your influences, it speaks to your buyer behaviour. It allows those who would wish to kind of create a capitalist model around this to be able to really target the experience that you have around that conversion to profit. And there is a sort of a quiet assumption in a lot of these platforms that that data is available to the platform owner by default. There's very little kind of opt-in or opt-out that users can currently do in this space without meaningfully, and to be able to meaningfully participate. Participation sort of equals consenting to data hemorrhage at this point. Some of the sort of evidence base that's being used to support this business model comes from a number of different researchers around the world, suggesting that without anyone needing to kind of have their name attached to anything or any of their personal sensitive details being revealed, it's really easy to identify which is that person based on the micro movements that they make with their heads and with their head, their hands, their height, that can be inferred by these tools. And so people are personally identifiable and then trackable across various different contexts by simply just being themselves and moving as themselves. And then when you bring in things like eye tracking, gaze detection, and pupil dilation and pupil swim, you can not only say that's definitely that person again, but that person is of a particular gender, age, ethnicity, geographic origin, cultural background. There's all sorts of suggestion that you can infer people's sexuality, their drug consumption, their level of sleepiness, whether they are neurotic. There's all sorts of claims made about what can be seen in this data. I can and you should be skeptical about whether that's true, about whether you can profile people to that level of granularity based on what their eyes do. But in a way, it doesn't really matter, because the people with running these platforms think it's true, and it's enough to kind of make that the business model for these spaces. Okay. I'm aware of time, so I might jump across convergence with artificial intelligence. Like all parts of every sector at the moment, AI is having a really kind of transformative impact on the way that virtual and social environments are constructed and how we have interactions with human and non-human agents. But I'm going to just leave that one sort of dangling for a Q&A if you want to come back for it, because it can get a little complex. What I wanted to I guess, sort of circle back to from what Catherine was saying about safety features is that there's a sort of a way of thinking about safety in virtual environments that is not always that helpful. There is a sort of a tendency, or there has been a tendency, when there's been kind of pushback from user communities, from law enforcement, from companies themselves to say we need to improve this, let's make things safe, to basically add a bunch of safety features, to just kind of bloat the features that are then available to people who are most likely to be unsafe in these spaces, and then putting the onus on those individuals to be able to kind of navigate increasingly complex, difficult user interaction systems, often in the moment of difficulty. And it kind of absents responsibility of the platform and the potential aggressor to have any kind of responsibility for their action. It's more about, can you block, can you throw up a personal safety bubble, can you report in time before the experience is escalated to a point that you would consider too much. And there's a lot of victim blaming. It's like, well, if you didn't like it, what are you doing here? Why didn't you just take your headset off? What's, that sort of noob shaming that can go on in these sectors. So there's a lot of sort of piling on features and cultures of blame that I think are unhelpful. What we have found helpful, certainly when speaking with policymakers, is to try and reframe the conversation. And rather than thinking, how many guardrails can you put on this? How many safety features do you need? Thinking instead about, do we agree that human rights apply here? We're not new to the planet. We're not new to each other. We have developed over hundreds of years kind of systems of social agreement about how we behave together and what happens if people violate that kind of contract of trust that is in our rights and our freedoms. We have systems in place within our physical world. We increasingly have systems in place that apply to the internet. We don't really have systems in place in this sort of hybrid between those two things that we found ourselves with now, where we're somewhere between feeling like we are physically present and feeling like we're online. It's still quite a new paradigm to try and understand, but we do have sort of mental models for how we understand both our physical and our digital behaviours, and what we think is okay and what we think is not okay. And I think for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN is a helpful way of saying, does this apply here? Is this sort of immersive social spatial environment somehow kind of immune from all of the various different articles about how we agree human dignity should be protected, or is it not? And that can really help, because it lets policymakers look at their existing statutes, their existing law books, and go, does this apply? Is the language of it making it difficult to apply it here? Do we need something new, or do we just need to enforce what we have? Are we even the right people, or is there a different agency or a different kind of group that needs to be empowered to work here? But it's a helpful way in, I think. We've looked a little bit at the different ways that sort of responsibility is understood in some of the work that we've done. There's a tendency in those kind of safety features things to put all the responsibility on the individual to manage their own safety. There's a sort of a slightly optimistic idea sometimes that a sort of a community of elders in these social virtual spaces will sort of step in and correct bad actors. The scale that it operates in is quite optimistic at this point. There's a question about whether the platform should hold a degree of accountability for the behaviour of their users that has been protected so far in US law, particularly, from being the case to this point. But UK and European law is starting to kind of pick away at that a little bit. It's quite interesting. And what role do the more kind of traditional government layers have? So what would happen if you reported something to the police, for example? Would they have a role to play in responding to a perceived abuse or a crime in these spaces? There's a few little framings that we have used with different policymakers and government sectors that helps to kind of understand that this is not done yet. We're not at a point where anything is inevitable. There's nothing fixed. The choices that get made and the positions that get taken now will have a quite strong influence on what comes next. And it's quite helpful sometimes to think about what those possible futures might look like. So just to talk you through, there's like 4 possible futures. They're not all using these cool characters, but I like this one very much. So this is a future we call the high seas. This is a fully decentralized libertarian paradise. These metaverse places become spaces that exist deliberately outside of societal norms and governance. There's a strong belief that the community is found to be the most confident people using the space, and therefore they best understand it and will police its behaviors. It's a space that's resistant to external forms of oversight or accountability. Opting into these spaces is effectively opting out of your societal norms, including laws, rights, and civic protections. Future 2, we're calling the surveillance state. So this is an environment in which all activity is tightly monitored and controlled by state actors, with complete government-level access to all activity at all times. Users in this space who are expressing a desire for anonymity or privacy would be treated with suspicion. Algorithmic monitoring of voice and behavior would seek to identify undesirable behavior, and virtual transgressions would have serious real-world consequences. This is already possible and arguably applicable in some contexts. Future 3, we could call the profit palace. So this is a business-first environment where companies lock down specific facets of the metaverse to really keenly protect and exploit highly profitable markets. Behavioral data from users would be understood to be the invisible currency of these spaces, made available to the platforms and corporations, and that would include psychological, unconsented biometric data from users, including effectively non-verbal and non-deliberately contributed data, such as your personal responses. So this data can be productized, allowing companies to personalize and target advertising, apply nudge psychology, and prolong and influence user behavior both in and outside of these contexts. And then there's Future 4, which we would call the Democratic Forum. And this is a virtual environment, a hybrid environment where democratic processes, systems of justice, and civil liberties are established in real-world contexts, are presumed to carry through into virtual spaces. A digital world where privacy and freedom of expression can coexist with governance and accountability. Clear, fair, and equitable terms of engagement enable companies to operate commercially within these spaces, driving cultures of entrepreneurship and creativity, whilst opening up new markets on an international footing, all preserving the assumption that human beings in this space carry with them their rights, privacies, and freedoms and protections that they have in their physical context and online. We're super interested to hear from you now to see if any of these things that we've been exploring, particularly, I guess we've been talking a lot to policymakers. It's really nice to talk to if you're all policymakers in the room, we're happy to talk to you too. But it's really nice to know kind of what resonates for you. We recognise, particularly friends in the US, it's a really challenging time at the moment. Questions of privacy, autonomy, ownership of these spaces and of all spaces is changing rapidly, and we just want to acknowledge and share sort of support for all of you in the different ways that you're engaging with that. But it would be great to now hear any thoughts and reflections that you have for us.
Thank you so much, Verity and Catherine. It's just really impressive, the work that you're doing, and inspiring. And it's interesting to me because you started off as practitioners and then went into research, and then you're kind of back having practical impact too. And that's because that it's related. I'm sure that's part of it. So it's really wonderful to see. It looks like we already have a question from Riot. You have the floor, Riot.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, Verity. Hi, Catherine. So nice to digitally meet both of you. I'm sure we've probably been in somewhat similar spaces before. I'm a faculty member at Arizona State University's LA campus, working with Nani De La Pena around a graduate program in immersive media. And so interesting to hear your work, your research. The critical implications of all of this are just so high right now, right? And I appreciate you both acknowledging that. I guess I have a couple questions and would just love to hear your thoughts on this. I guess the first one is, and apologies, I'm creating my lunch while I'm talking to you, and I want to make sure the toast doesn't burn in the pan. So excuse the double tasking here. But I guess my first question is around, this really good distinction between representation and simulation. And I was bringing this up in the MIT Open Doc Lab fellow meeting a couple of weeks back, but thinking about Susan Sontag's research, specifically regarding the pain of others, right? And the research that she found, more or less kind of stipulating that people will look at other people's pain and have a variety of reactions. It doesn't necessarily, as she's suggesting, elicit empathy or compassion or one sort of singular emotive response. And so looking at that from representation, when we jump to simulation, and a kind of what I'm hearing in your research is the same thing, that a little bit perhaps in simulation, we have all different kinds of actors. So I guess I'm just curious if you both have kind of dove a little bit deeper into that question, right, which I think has been in the field for a long time, which is, right, initially it was this suggestion that VR drives empathy, and we've kind of moved away from that, and we understand now that there's a little bit more of a variety of possibilities, but there's more nuance, I think, right, with simulation, as you're both pointing to, in terms of what it does neurologically. So I'm just curious if you two have done research further into that and what you found. And then my second sort of question or thing I'd love to hear you two talk about is just the stakes of the moment, right? Seeing that you both, all these companies and, government officials you're working with, in the US, as you know, right, we have Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos who've literally kind of stolen our democracy, particularly Musk, but also the other two, and are now threatening the peril of our planet on a really vast, large scale in a way we've never seen before. So I'd just kind of love to hear you two talk about we know the stakes are high, but how do we make, as creators, those choices with what I know we have some students in the room as well, with what we engage with technology-wise, right? How we engage with companies like Meta at this moment in which data extrapolation is so high and the stakes of that. As a person who personally I'm transgender, right, where it's like, I don't want any of these companies having my data anymore, and I can't retract that either. And now I'm in a position that's quite vulnerable. So mentioning, also tons of other people in very similar and worse situations. So I guess I just would love to hear your collective thoughts around that, given all the work and the research that you've done. And thank you. It's really, really interesting to hear. So deeply appreciate you guys sharing today.
Thanks for so much for your reflections and such really, really interesting, provocative questions. I think, Verity, the first question to me probably is very relevant to your research into simulation of risk, right?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's lots to say. Thank you very much for the questions. You were asking initially a little bit about that that kind of subjectivity of people's responses, and I really love that you've pulled that through, because I think often the policymakers included and lots of people are kind of going, is it this or is it that? Like, what is it that this technology is, that it's somehow kind of like it's an empathy machine or it's not? And it kind of strips the context and the humanity of the people who are engaging with it out of the picture, because it's messy somehow. So one of the pieces of research that I was lucky to be involved with a few years ago was with a company called Headset, who create sort of training simulations, particularly for journalists who are going to be in high risk, high stress environments. They use these sorts of scenarios, like simulation scenarios, as a way to kind of like emotionally and physically prepare for going into these conflict zones and places of social unrest, to kind of rehearse what they will do and how to kind of respond with a fight, freeze, flight response that they might expect there. And they worked with us to try and understand what their responsibilities were, putting people in effectively high stress simulations, given that it can be quite psychologically affecting, it can feel quite real. People do have all of these very kind of visceral responses that we've spoken about today. And we found lots of interesting things in that research, but one of the things that I think came out most strongly for me is that it was so dependent on the journalists who were doing it. Journalists who had been in what they sort of affectionately termed like Big Bang environments and had these quite kind of high stress examples, responded incredibly powerfully to the simulation, because it kind of brought them back to that state that they were familiar with. And that was sort of good, bad, and different, depending on what that brought through for them, and how they were kind of supported through that process. Equally, for journalists who were effectively sort of students who hadn't done anything in the field yet, it was incredibly sort of intense, because it was sort of confronting them with what their work might be in the future. Whereas for journalists who had sort of started in the sector but perhaps hadn't had a direct experience of that nature, a lot of them were really bored by it. They were like, well, nothing happened. Like, this isn't, I dial it up, dial it up, dial it up. So these things are so subjective and so particular, and it's really hard to anticipate when you put people in these sort of simulations what it's going to mean for them. So there's a question about kind of, what does consent look like? How can we give people the information that they need to be able to participate and to be able to check out if it's not working for them, or to communicate what their needs are in respect to that? And there isn't a one size fits all in the way that there isn't in life. So yeah, trying to kind of allow for that human subjectivity to come back into the conversation seems clear, but is often missing from the picture when we're like, is it safe or is it not safe? So yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance that we're still quite early in the way that we talk about these things. But yeah, I think there's also a great point that you made about people witness pain differently in these contexts. And there's a brilliant researcher who I know Sarah works with called Julia Scott Stevenson, based in Australia, who talks about the fact it's not an empathy response. It's kind of like how you would respond if you saw that. So you can kind of you're still yourself. You can be in this scenario and you can observe your own response to that, but you will only know your own response. You won't suddenly know the response of the person who's the subject of that. You don't have a sort of a magical insight into somebody's life experience just by sort of standing next to it in a VR experience. So yeah, trying to kind of like recognize that we bring our own subjectivity, and that will have a massive bearing on how we experience these spaces, can feed in, I think, to the nuance of what we do.
And I think just to add on that perception of pain, it's interesting to look at the top games on the like most popular games, for instance, for MetaQuest. So many of them are first-person shooters that involve witnessing, say, the person you're shooting or whatever, like their pain, and that's part of it, like entertainment factor. So yeah, just by showing someone's pain doesn't necessarily. It's a very interesting and I think a concerning question on that. Just seeing someone's pain, we can't assume that's going to create empathy in immersive.
Yeah, people have very different attitudes about whether they're in a gaming environment or whether they're in a social environment, and they'll bring different cultures to those spaces that don't always match with each other.
I just want just to add on the question on what, like, I guess we're talking about what we can do and what how we can interact with these companies and governments, etc. I think I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this as well here. This is very open, relevant discussion. I guess that something I've been thinking about a lot lately is that the technology spaces shouldn't be separate from the democratic process and democratic frameworks that we have, but we do know in general work. So, or at least work better than anything else we know of.
We've been working on them for longer.
What's that, sorry?
We've been working on them for longer.
Yeah. So bringing the metaverse, we could call it that, or immersive spaces, into the world of like politics can help. So in the UK, I think let's get our local MPs, members of parliament, into virtual reality. In the US, is that getting Congress people into virtual reality, senators into virtual reality, at least so that like when they're talking about it, when they're legislating, they just have some knowledge, like even something basic. That I think that would just really help. And then, you know, next level to actually, so that it can become immersively literate, to understand it properly.
Yeah, Catherine's done some amazing work with police forces in the UK, helping to bring this into their kind of understanding of what it is, so that when people do come forward with complaints or concerns, that they have some context and they don't dismiss or panic. Just one more point to you had an interesting question there about kind of how do we resist this sort of data, being the data is the sort of the presumed currency of these spaces. It's interesting to see how different companies are framing it. So, for example, within Meta's kind of user agreement, it's a little unclear as to whether they're already using the data. They sort of mostly say that they're not currently using the data, but the explicit terms of reference reserve the right to do so. Whereas with Apple's sort of new spatial computing paradigm, they explicitly say that data never leaves the headset, so they don't have access to it, and neither does anyone else. And they have a kind of a, you know, the sort of it's the classic difference in the way that some companies have been operating and others have been kind of making a virtue of their data privacy, whereas others have that as kind of this is how we make things free or cheap for you. So having that difference of attitude starting to come into the sector helps, but equally, as long as it's not a had conversation, as long as consumers aren't saying it's important to me that I have some level of data privacy and that my eyeballs don't belong to you, as long as that's not a consideration for the companies, they're not terribly incentivized to do anything other than use that as a income stream, as they have done before. So it partly is kind of consumer behavior that will drive that. And if there's a massive kind of pushback saying it's not, I don't want this product if it doesn't have a level of privacy, and I'm I'm not super into having to pay thousands of pounds for my privacy, then it does make a difference to the way these products are designed. At the moment, it's just such a low level of conversation about that, and the assumption being made, we think, at that kind of company level, is actually people are pretty chill about contributing their data if it means they get free services now. So if we want something different, we have to ask for it.
That's interesting. You've, looked at governments, looked at corporations. Have you also thought about public campaigns to sort of educate?
Yeah, the UK loves a public service broadcast. We've got sort of,
Yeah.
but it feels like a slightly old-fashioned thing to do now. There's, our sort of historical friends in the BBC and things are all for public information, but actually the way that people access information is not really through that kind of public broadcast media type language. People are finding their information in different places. So trying to understand where those levers of influence might be that are actually kind of going to reach people.
Right.
And we're a couple of like middle-aged white women, so there's a limit to the reach.
So middle-aged Verity
wins that category.
To find the influence, right? Yeah, I wasn't thinking PSAs.
Really
I was just
question.
thinking,
like, how do if we feel like there's an absence of that discourse,
how
like,
do you get consumers charged up about it? Okay, we have 2 more questions, and maybe more after that. But Marusa Levstek, you're on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. And it's great to hear about your work, Verity and Catherine. I've been following it for a while, so it's great to be able to chat about it today as well. And kind of alluding from a previous conversation about actions, my question is kind of what can we do? What can we do as researchers, academics, creatives and users? What can we do to tackle some of these risks and create a sense of ownership and privacy?
I think to slightly contradict myself, there has been a good amount of interest from policymakers around the world. It is waning slightly. There is a little bit of a hype cycle that takes the interest of politicians at different times. And I think we're aware that this year and last year, particularly, the kind of the inevitable like focus on AI has sort of pulled some of the resource away from this question. And there is a bit of a temptation, I think, in policy circles to imagine that it's sort of done, maybe, or that maybe people aren't doing that anymore, despite lots of evidence to the contrary that actually the people involved in these virtual social environments is the communities of use are growing significantly, and therefore the harms are growing exponentially. So I think partly being able to keep pulling focus when it's not as zeitgeisty as it was, that's a really important thing to do. So as Catherine says, kind of making it an agenda point for the people of power that you have access to in your local communities, being noisy on the internet. Like there is something to be said for just kind of like holding that space and thinking about, for example, there is some brilliant people advocating for a right to mental privacy as something that should be inculcated in law. It's something that just wasn't really needed before because mental privacy meant don't say it out loud. Whereas now that we have all of these biometric ways of interpreting what people are thinking in a way that they are effectively thinking at a subconscious level and they haven't chosen to contribute, there's a whole new paradigm in kind of mental privacy, neural rights that you can contribute to if it's something that you care about. There's some really brilliant people doing work in that. So yeah, finding those levers, I think, to keep this stuff on the government agendas, and slightly resisting the pushback that sometimes comes to governments, which is like, it's not your responsibility to do this, the market will regulate itself. There's a danger to that narrative having too much ground as well, in my personal opinion. So yeah, kind of keep on going.
I think as well, like bringing people in, I really just second what Verity says. Imagine also like more people being noisy on the internet and more people raising this as like public agenda item by just bringing more people into like immersive spaces, and more people who maybe don't fit the like early adopter stereotype. So broadening that pool. If you have a VR headset, like showing it to people, and getting like really you don't have to set the conversation up like, isn't this cool? Don't you think this is great? It's more like, I would love to get your thoughts on this, your critical feedback, and then let's share that with the world, kind of perspective. So yeah, more critical engagement, more encouraging in your circle, in your networks, that sort of a critique of a mindset rather than being like bedazzled. That's, I think, as in general, yeah, engagement where we can put down, maybe we're initially dazzled, but we can just put that to a side for a moment.
Yeah, and also, you know, you talked about the democratic forum and, you know, these future worlds. And I wonder too, if there's already communities online within these spaces that can model, you know, that there's models of what an online space could be.
Yeah, that's a really important point, actually, and I think there's a risk, I think, in the way that we've discussed the kind of the slightly endemic amount of harassment in these spaces. There are also incredibly brilliant, kind, loving communities, and it's, you know, and there's lots of sort of suggestion, actually. For example, queer communities are finding really wonderful spaces to collect from international contexts where they're not always having those sort of support networks. So there's lots of really brilliant ways that people are finding kind of ways around some of these toxic cultures and creating beautiful communities. But they're having to kind of do that almost in spite of the design frame of these spaces that just don't in any way seem to take responsibility for the actions of those who seek to abuse these platforms and yeah, sort of are using them in a predatory way or in an abusive way, because there's very little expectation that they will be held accountable for that action. So it's partly another like action, I guess, to be able to take is to sort of demand that these platforms and these publishers take some degree of responsibility if effectively the design of their space is enabling and supporting abusive action, because they are, you know, they are potentially really wonderful environments, and lots of people find ways to make them wonderful environments, and it should be more possible to do that. You shouldn't have to wade through a bunch of horrors to find kin.
There are some like really wonderful like events, for instance, in VR chat that I've been to, and like loads of great stuff. And that's, I guess, in sharing this harms, we have to, when we're talking to policymakers, you have to sometimes go through the shock factor in order to get them to act. So that's why work does to have that. But there, as Verity says, some really beautiful communities, and like some events I've been to, I think what makes it work is when they take techniques that work in the real world from making something like a safer feeling space. So, you know, something that works, for instance, is like having a sense of purpose to that event, and having people there who are like organizing it, who sort of take responsibility for that space in that moment. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you need like bouncers as such, the security, but something that just has a sense of like people will have accountability to their actions. And then maybe also like a sense of like a sort of, there's like a root community, a core to it, where it's not like a sort of transient set of individuals, but there are some network already between some people there, so that you already have a sense of like sort of group norm and culture, where there's a really welcoming spirit as well to that. Yeah, I've been to some incredible events in VR, so I don't, yeah, I guess I never want anyone to think our work is, we're like ignoring that. I hope you don't.
So Kat, you have a question or comment? Kat Cizek.
Hi, Verity and Catherine. Thank you so much for this amazing work and wonderful presentation as well. Really laid it out. I'm curious, maybe you addressed it and I missed it. Apple Vision Pro. Perhaps it's aspirational, but this idea of integrating these virtual worlds with everything else in our digital lives is, you know, definitely the mandate at the Vision Pro headset. And then second question, I think related, you said, you know, to come back to AI, and that you were going to skip that part of your presentation. So I'm curious what you have to say there. Thank you again.
It's like Apple Vision and Go Pro, they've gone for such a different strategy, where it's like enhancing what you're doing in the real world and sort of supercharging that. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, of course. There's different approaches though, you know, there's also a demand for people who want to go into like a completely other metaverse space, and I guess maybe they've got very, very different target markets. But yeah, the price point there, of course, that is going to affect the initial user community. And Verity, do you want to talk about like hand over on the AI
Yeah, I'm gonna stay in this sort of hybrid space as well for a moment. I think I really appreciate you. I was saying to Catherine, I sort of had like a slide for exactly that thing because it's really on my mind at the moment. But the focus of the research that we've been doing so far has been largely looking at those sort of all surrounding virtual reality environments. But increasingly, I do think Apple Vision Pro and others, the roadmap is completely towards this sort of like the ability to overlay virtual experiences into your physical world, and there's no reason to expect that AI particularly won't kind of supercharge that, because the ability to kind of quite quickly interpret the physical surroundings and to bring virtual environments into that space meaningfully is happening, right? So I think if there's anything that needs more research now, it's to understand how these sorts of questions apply when it's not a kind of put headset on and disappear to another world, when it's more about put some sort of wearable on and augment your existing world. I have some kind of concerns about what it means if what I see isn't what you see in my everyday life. You know, if I basically have a filter turned on that makes everybody a kitten for my own amusement, but you don't know that you're a kitten when I'm talking to you, like, is that okay? Do I get to kittenify you? And that's a cute version of something that could be much darker. So you know, what right do I have to kind of augment you and the world around me? What right does the company that owns my wearable have to look at what I'm looking at and to make assumptions and to know that you're there now because I looked at you with my kitten goggles on? What right do you have to have some sense of collective reality if you don't choose to wear the wearables, or you can't afford to, or you're kind of just feeling cut out for whatever reason? Does it create this kind of imbalance in our sense of what common reality is that Catherine raised earlier? I think that goes up by an order of magnitude if we are going to kind of become more comfortable with the idea that we're always augmenting and that it's a kind of an always on thing. And then, you know, if I can afford to take down all the adverts, but you can't, like, is it reasonable that I'm just walking around with my kitten goggles on while you're having to listen to a podcast about kittens because you walked past me? I'm getting very into kitten land, but it feels to me like there are so many of these questions that sort of go up a notch actually when we are suggesting that devices like these could be every day in our working environments, could be part of our social context. You know, how do we kind of understand something of this now that will help us to set good kind of social expectations for each other when we do move into these more kind of everyday encounters, and it's not sort of stopping and going somewhere else, it's just everything. So yeah, lots to do. AI, oh God. What do we want to say about AI? I think in this specific context, I think there's some good questions for policymakers about what a real person is. Particularly in law, there's this question of what constitutes a natural person, and a lot of the way that the legal challenges are coming now is that if someone is behaving in a way that might be considered harassing, abusive, violation of human rights in a virtual space, the law doesn't automatically assume that that's a person that did that, because that was an avatar. If you, for example, you know, had a game character that you were playing in Fortnite, that you're not responsible for the violence of that Fortnite character. And so are you, as the person kind of operating an avatar in a public space, responsible for it? What about AI generated characters that have no natural person associated with them? Are they somehow kind of responsible for their behavior? In the instances that Catherine was mentioning, where people are effectively commissioning avatars with whom to simulate abuse scenarios, what rights does the person have whose likeness is being used to create those? There's a lot of challenges around the sort of extra level of simulation that can be achieved with AI. So in terms of the generative AI to create assets and avatars and environments, there's a question about whether AI is effectively a solve to this question of moderation. Very often, as Catherine was saying, you know, these sorts of environments can be better. They can have culture setting better if there's someone who's hosting, but that's not always achievable at scale. So do you just have kind of AI bots that are moderating all the time? Is that surveillance by the back door? Like, how do we feel about having a kind of an always listening AI agent moderating our social encounters? And then there's the question about transparency, like, do we have a right to know when something has been kind of generated based on our behavior to please us or to influence us, or do we not? So there's all kinds of questions, not a lot of answers currently. But yeah, certainly that question about what constitutes a person when a lot of these spaces may have not been associated initially or eventually with a natural person. Like, there's a bunch of stuff coming down the pipe on that.
Well, thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your work, for the work that you're doing. It's really important, the important questions that you're asking and trying to address. Thank you for that. From all of us who work in this space and all humans. Thank you to Akmirat Tuliev, who is the producer for the public talks for Open Doc Lab and Co-Creation Studio. Thank you to our funders, MacArthur Foundation and Ford Foundation. Couldn't do this without you. And we'll be back on March 18th with a talk from Nuf Al-Jowarsir, and she's a new media artist and researcher. So until then, be well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Our pleasure.